Good afternoon, and welcome to this plenary session with the grand but somewhat vague title, Orchestrating a New Concert of Powers. I'm Rick Smith, the chairman of Newsweek, and it's my honor to serve as moderator for this truly distinguished panel. Whatever the official themes, Davos has always been about shifting power relationships. And the underlying assumption of today's discussion is that we are in the midst of an important power transition. Certainly in economic terms, with the growth of Asia, the rise of financial power based on resource wealth, and the increasing influence of sovereign wealth funds. But also perhaps in broader political terms as well, as these new players exercise potential political influence on the global landscape. To examine that shift and assess its impact on global security, we have assembled an all-star panel of global thinkers and actors. To begin to list their accomplishments would take up the entire hour, so I will simply welcome Lloyd Blankfein, Chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs, Dr. Henry Kissinger, distinguished statesman and co-chair of this year's Forum annual meeting, Shimon, the President of Israel and a frequent Davos participant over the years, Aleksey Kudrin, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of the Russian Federation, Bernard Kouchner, Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of France, and last but certainly not least, Yong-Boon, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. Lloyd, from your perspective, how real is the shift in global financial power, and what are the implications of those changes for the private sector, the markets, and for governments?
Well, I think it's pretty vivid as the entire world beats a path to the repositories of all the excess investment capital in the world, and that's very visible. I would say this shift has been going on for some time. My firm wrote a piece on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, talking about how those economies would exceed the G7 economies within 35 or 40 years. It actually will happen much sooner. We see a situation today where the emerging markets account for more than half the excess demand in the world, 3/4 the foreign exchange reserves, and vast amount of the hopes and dreams of the planet, frankly, are invested in that growth staying firm and decoupling from the developed world. So that shift has definitely been ongoing for some time. I think the recent popularization has really struck people very hard, and think that there's a very, very new phenomenon, and it really has been an acceleration. I think the emerging markets learned a lot from the currency crisis in '98, and obviously have been accumulating reserves. But I think the importance of that economic shift was underappreciated before, and because of what's going on now with the refinancing, for example, of Wall Street firms by that group and the investments in the sovereign wealth firms, it may be over-exaggerated now a little bit, the power of these organizations. All these countries have real problems. I mean, the emerging markets as a whole are now creditors to the rest of the developed world, but in some cases it's a funny creditor relationship where the creditors have a lower standard of living than the countries they're funding. There are real problems in these countries. They have to deal with environmental issues, infrastructure issues. Their capital markets aren't. Part of the reasons why capital is accumulating, notwithstanding a lower standard of living, is they can't really spend it at home, even though there's a cry for better life and more consumption at home, but they don't have the ability to do that. So I think that there is a power that's shifting. With that financial power shifting, inevitably will become a desire for control and legitimacy for influence in the places in which they're investing, but they will also be a little bit saddled with handling their own internal problems for quite some time.
Given what you've said and the recent turmoil in the markets, starting in the U.S. and spilling over to the rest of the world, is there a decoupling? You mentioned it may have been overemphasized. Talk about the relationship between what's happening in the developing world's markets and the rest of the world.
Well, in the emerging markets and the kind of founders of the sovereign wealth funds come in at several different categories. Some sell commodities, and some have their reserves from trade and compounding. But in both cases, they involve selling, and you sell your assets and you sell your labor and you trade in markets in which there's, where consumption is high. And so I don't think that the emerging world is a slave to the fortunes of the United States or the wider developed world. And so there's some element of decoupling, but it can't be. It's impossible for it to be a complete decoupling. And I think the market, by the way, I think you saw that in the market where for a long time, if you looked at the equity markets, there really was that decoupling, and I think people optimistically pronounced it a decoupled market, and in the last couple of weeks people are saying, whoa, how can that growth rate be maintained in export-driven economies and commodity-based economies if the ultimate source of demand is receding?
Dr. Kissinger, you have traditionally focused on military and political power. How has the dispersion of financial power affected global security? As a bottom line question, does that make the world a safer or a more dangerous place?
I'm always flattered when somebody asks me a question with an economic implication, and especially when there are so many economic experts. Can I answer it about the dispersion of power in general?
Sure.
Without going into that. I think there has been a fundamental change in the international system as we've known it, which has produced a dispersion. The international system as we've known it has been based on states and on the notion of sovereignty of these states. Now, in areas of the world, this is breaking down. In Europe, the state is being abandoned or reduced in significance, and this affects the capacity of the government to ask sacrifices of its people, and it has not yet created a substitute on a European basis. In the Middle East, the state never had the same significance, and there is an assault on the very structure of the international system, as one has known it, on the basis of concepts that go beyond the state. Then there is this, what is often described as a shift of power from the financial and otherwise from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and within the Pacific region towards China and India to some extent. And then there's the emergence of a whole new set of problems that have not existed before, of which I would list proliferation as one of the key issues, because in the past, when you've had changes in power relationships, it would produce military crisis. But with the proliferation of weapons, with weapons of mass destruction, this has become so obviously unprofitable that there is a greater emphasis towards international solutions and a greater need to international solutions. The world in which I was in government was a two-power world. I mean, we thought in terms of almost a zero-sum game with the Soviet Union. The world that is taking place today has extraordinary complexity with many intangible factors. The risks in the world I knew best were greater. The risks in the current world are more complex and harder to calculate. So this what I would...
So quite apart from the financial dispersion of power, the proliferation of actors with other kinds of power have made the world a more difficult place.
There's no precedent in which every part of the world was undergoing changes simultaneously of this magnitude, and where these changes were linked to each other in some way. And the nature of these changes is not the same. So you cannot apply one recipe to all situations, since the character of the changes is different from region to region.
President Peres, when the word complexity is uttered, the Arab-Israeli dispute almost inevitably is the follow-up thought. Given the changes in the financial power relationships and the kind of political changes that Henry was talking about, do you see these changes as making your task in the search for peace in your part of the world as more difficult, or are there reasons for optimism in the financial transformation?
Well, I believe we are not talking just about markets and financing. We are talking about two different systems that are running our lives today. One is a traditional system made of governments, and the other the new system of non-governmental organizations, like large corporations, global one. Well, when we have had a government, there were reasons for wars, because usually wars stem from the disputes about land. Government has had to defend them. Once we went over from land to science, there was no need really to go to war. Not only that, most of the problems became global. The most obvious one is environment. You cannot handle it nationally. The other is economy. I do not believe there are any more national economies. There are only national poverties. If you want to run an economy, you must become global. And also the use of force lost a great deal of its importance, because the other management, the new system, is made of companies. They don't have armies, they don't have police, they don't have laws, but they do have goodwill. And they're running the world not on power, but on really conquering the hearts of the people, not the land of the people. And may I also add to it that governments are good for war and poor for peace. They are good for war because if a nation is being attacked, we unite, the government is united, and we face the war. But when it comes to peace, or rather the cost of peace, it divides the nation. Because some people say you pay too much, you pay too early, you trust too much. And the cost of peace divides the nation, where you have to negotiate simultaneously with your opponent on one hand and your own people on the other hand. You must be forthcoming enough to attract the opponent, but be careful not to lose the support of your own people. And for that reason, I do believe that the global participation is essential. Then again, I think the real war today, more than it is among governments, it's among generations. A generation that was born and used to national governments and national traditions, and they're afraid that modernity may endanger it, so they go to war. But you cannot live anymore on tradition. I shall take two examples on tradition. One is land. Agriculture became unimportant today. It went down from 50 or 60% to 1 and 1.5%. But even more so, ideologically and socially, would be the attitude toward women. You cannot progress today unless you give equal rights to women. I think the greatest achievement in the 20th century was the equality of women. You cannot progress if women are being discriminated, and so are their children, and they go backward. Now I see the struggle is not only, say, between Israel and the Palestinians. It is within each camp, also among the Palestinians. It goes slowly, because to get rid of a tradition is extremely difficult. And get in a new situation is also quite difficult. But it's moving, in my judgment. I do hope that the non-governmental participation will save the day. Because when I look since the Second World War, every important thing in our life happened economically. more than politically or more than militarily. China was changed, India was changed, Europe was changed without armies, without wars. And also, the governments are victims of their own past, of their own prejudices. The new organizations are unprecedented, so they don't have a past, so they don't have prejudices, so they don't have obligations. They can look at the world with a fresh eye. They don't see borders, because borders are important for science.
So can we conclude that the rise of the Gulf states, for example, as one of the world's financial superpowers, may be positive in the sense that you're talking about because it promotes change within those societies?
Well, I shall give you an anecdote, but a good example. One of the richest countries in the Gulf, I shall not mention the name, has the largest financial reservoir. It's close to $1 trillion. But 70% of their people are suffering from diabetes. And what can you do with the money if you are sick? And you cannot overcome the sickness unless and until you enter the new age in food, in concept, in manners, in behaviors. And I think that building on goodwill is really making former divisions and distinctions disappearing gradually. I would say that I build very much, because peace today is not a matter just of negotiations. It's very hard to negotiate. You have to build peace, not negotiate peace. And the builders of peace are the people who are looking at the future, because those companies are interested in stability, they are interested in peace, and by the way, the management of those companies is highly intelligent. It's not the old Byrons. They know exactly where they are living and what is on their mind. They know they have to contribute. They cannot just make money. They must keep transparency. They must trust each other. You call it modernity, but it's already many values of democracy, of a different life. And I feel that we are living in a period of great change. What we politicians can do is to make it happen sooner and to save lives of all people.
Deputy Prime Minister Kudrin, you represent one of the emerging financial powers. Your boss, Mr. Putin, has said that Russia's resource wealth and increasing financial power demand a seat at the table, unquote, in global political discussions. What does that mean from your perspective? Which tables and to what end?
Спасибо, я буду говорить по-русски. Вчера на пленарном заседании мы слышали интересное предложение доктора Шваба. Он сказал, что Соединенным Штатам отводится роль рояля в оркестре. Государственный секретарь Кондолиза Райс задала вопрос, кто же дирижер в этом оркестре. Это очень важно найти свое место и выяснить, кто дирижер. Я бы сказал, что постановка вопроса господина Путина, она немножко шире, чем только...
The way Mr. Putin put the question was a bit wider. He wasn't just talking about the use of energy resources. Indeed, we have this objective trend in the world, rapidly growing economies. In the last 3 years, developing countries lost 10% in the world GDP, whereas developing world acquired additional 10%, and this is rapid growth. The EU lost 5% of its share in the world economy in the last 5 years. And given the latest forecast of Goldman Sachs, in the next 40 years, the BRIC countries will be in the first 10, and Russia will be number 5 economy of the world, according to that forecast. So it's very important how decisions will be taken, whether a bipolar world will prevail or a single polar world, and who will develop the decisions, who will make the decisions. So I think today we're discussing a very timely issue of widening the G8. Perhaps there will be the G13. We know Sarkozy's proposal and support it. We know Tony Blair's proposal. There are other proposals. We have to enlarge the UN Security Council. The IMF should also review and revise its shareholding structure and enlarge the share of emerging markets, developing markets. Today, China and India's share together is smaller than the share of Belgium in the IMF capital structure. So we are wondering whether IMF will continue to remain the place where strategic decisions are being developed, or whether it will lose its legitimacy. This is the choice we're facing today. Already now we must look and revise the bodies where collective decisions are being taken. Collective policy, collective decisions are the word of the day. Now, if we talk about energy and Russia's resources, then I think in the eyes of the West, Russia's role and the way Russia is using energy is growing when the oil prices are growing, and it would also be reduced once oil prices fall. I think this role is exaggerated. And I think that is the result of worries and concerns to do with certain distortions and disproportions at the energy consumption markets.
I'd like to follow up on the energy question in particular. There seems to be, as you alluded, a great deal of concern in Europe that Russia will use its oil and gas wealth to advance a specific political agenda on the continent. Do you have anything to say that might reassure or perhaps deepen the concerns of your European friends?
You know, today, in the morning, we're discussing the role of sovereign wealth funds and what they do when they invest in developed economies. We decided that so far these funds have invested $3 trillion and did not give rise to any concern, but for some reason today there is some concern about future investment from these funds. As far as Russia's supplies to Europe are concerned, now there have never been any problems, it's always been reliable, there have never been any issues. However, currently questions are being raised. I will quote words of our experts who say that today's rise of oil prices is of course linked with rise in consumption, but production was growing in a rather stable manner. What wasn't planned, and nobody really thought of it, is the growth in consumption. The responsibility of consumers for transparency of their consumption forecasts is also great. So during G8 meetings in St. Petersburg the year before last, we spoke very openly about the need for partnership between consumers and producers, that we need processing infrastructure, we need logistics and networks, and we need proper relationship with final consumers of energy. So I think we're talking about mutual responsibility of both producing countries and consuming countries. So we are proposing partnership approach, partnership relationship, where both sides would have more participation in each other's assets, in production assets and in consumption assets. We are quite happy to think of free investment regime for production, but then would like to take part in distribution and in retail. I am convinced that we have a very reliable future for supplying fuel, oil and gas to Europe, and to increase these supplies. 85% of what we supply is consumed by European countries, and I'm convinced that we shall provide reliable supplies, as we have always done. Thank you.
We heard yesterday in the economic brainstorming session that the G8 and Europe in particular ignores the emerging players only at its peril. How do you integrate these new players in the global discussion, and does Europe have a particular role to play in that process?
Yes, I think so. Well, last time I was addressing this very distinguished audience, I was talking in the name of NGOs. And something has changed because my good friend Shimon Peres, he's now the president of Israel, was answering as an NGO. So, thank you very much. This is the global governance. Shimon.
We are all NGOs now.
Sort of. But now I'm involved in a particular technical politics. And yes, there is a real demand to Europe, addressed to Europe. And we have to think about what was Europe. A voluntarily, an example of voluntarism. And now it comes to a sort of example, a model to be followed, and also a pattern to be set up. And this is a unique example of sovereignty and diversity, but it was a voluntary demarche. 60 years after, yes, I believe that there is a real originality coming from Europe. But remember, yes, we are talking with the different voices. Why? Because we are talking to the third world, we are exactly like our Russian colleague said, we're in favor of a G, not 13, like my good president Nicolas Sarkozy asked for, but 14, because we need also an Arabian Muslim country inside a G something. So G14, yes, we want to come back to the reform of the UN system, to the reform of the Security Council, to the OSCDA reform, to Bretton Woods Organization agencies reform. Yes, yes, yes. But we are facing also internal problems in Europe. This is very difficult to set up Europe. We have 27 countries and we have problems of border, we have problem of project, and we have problem of power, borders. We were used to limit our borders because of the external pressure, historically. And now, because of internal pressure, we are looking for the extension of the 27 countries. And believe me, to be part of these 27 countries as a foreign minister or as a minister or as a citizen, you have to wait for the 26 other to take the floor before you. It takes hours. And this is something, changing yourself. Europe is certainly a challenge against yourself, your arrogance, your diversity, and your so-called sovereignty. So borders, let's talk about borders, let's talk about Turkey, let's talk about Serbia, about Ukraine, etc., etc. On project, our fathers, invented Europe against something. Against war first, against nationalism, against communism. And now we have to turn our attention to a project, to look and to fight for something. And this is globalization. And this is the way we have to invent to start listening to the others. Because the main challenge in the world is to transform globalization in progress in the developing world. To transform, to offer to the people. And another time, I agree with Shimon Peres, poverty is the challenge. How to change poverty. And the last thing, it's of course power, how to build a new diplomacy with the others, not alone. This is a good school. Europe is a real good university. Not to be, I told you for the second time, not to be too much arrogant. The others, you have to talk in their name. You have to say we for 27 countries in the same time. That's why this is a very particular example. And in not United States, in America, in Asia, in Africa now, they are in a way following this example because this is the new way to respect the others. In addition, you have to respect your citizens too, and to convince them. This is another story.
But implicit in your comment is that it may be more difficult to achieve a consensus for something than it was to achieve a consensus against something.
If I may, I give you an example. I believe, this is brief and too much quick, of course, but to have a diplomacy, to have a sort of influence in the world, you need a defense. Because, certainly, not as an ideal, but because of the coming back of violence, sectarism, extreme religious extremism, etc., etc. So we have to set up a European defense. And this is particularly difficult, but this is a fantastic opportunity, also with the change in the United States of America, the coming change of presidency. We have to offer them a project of partnership different.
George, fairly or unfairly, it falls to you to speak for Asia. And as we were discussing earlier, you mentioned that the big challenge was to integrate the global giants in India and China into the world community. How do they fit, and how should the world respond to integrate them into the global community?
I've just come from a luncheon session on Asia. The Indian Finance Minister, Chidambaram, made this point starkly. He said, by 2025, Asia will account for 60% of global production, which was the position 200 years ago. So he said, it's one full turn of the chakra, the wheel. Well, he may be wrong by 10 years, it doesn't matter. But this is an enormous shift of power and influence in the world. It is mainly the story of the rise of China and India. It's never been in the past that new powers emerge on such a massive scale without intervening wars and revolutions. So the challenge for us is, how do we maintain the peace in Asia and the world in this century? It will not be easy, because there will be enormous political, economic, financial stresses. We talk about sovereign welfare funds, we talk about global financial stability. These are only aspects of a much bigger, profound phenomenon. Whether or not we're able to rise to this challenge depends on how the existing powers, the US, Europe, Japan, Russia, deal with India and China individually and collectively. And also on how these two countries, China and India, deal with each other. It's a big drama. Bilaterally, of course, the single most important relationship in the coming decades is the Sino-US relationship. If that is mishandled, all bets are off, because these are two colossal powers with high technology who can do enormous harm to each other and to the world. And in Asia, for us, it is also how China and India manage their re-encounter with each other. Through Southeast Asia, which has been their historical meeting place, and therefore countries like Singapore have a deep interest in their interaction, and increasingly also over the high Himalayas. But it is the accommodation into the global system which is the most important. I fully agree with Bernard Kouchner and Deputy Prime Minister Kudrin and others that the sooner China and India are brought into the G7 or G8, the better. Either they are part of the solution for many of the world's problems, like financial stability or the health of the international trading system or the control of pandemics or proliferation, or they become a part of the problem, and climate change as well. The institutions which we have, they don't work very well because they were the result of the Second World War. So either leadership enables these institutions to be reformed, or we'll run into crisis and increasingly bigger ones, and then it'll be crisis which will force us to change these institutions. Thank you.
I have about 47 more questions, but I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask your own questions. So if we could turn to your questions now. It's difficult to see who's out there and where the microphone is up here. Raise your hand and identify yourself and a question, not a speech, please.
Laura Nicholson, Yale University. To what extent do you believe that the growing global economic interdependence of countries small and large, to what degree does economic interdependence shield us from war?
Dr. Kissinger, would you like to take that? I realize it has an economic base, but a political outcome.
I think the first thing to remember, it's something like that was said before World War I too, that the economic interdependence of Europe would make war impossible. But I'd like to point out one aspect, that there is a gap now, I believe, between the economic organization of the world and the political organization of the world. The economic world is organized more or less on a globalized basis. And the key decisions that major corporations make are made on a basis that is global by criteria that go beyond borders and that are judged by principles of efficiency and profit. The consequences of these decisions affect individuals who live in political units, states, usually states. They then expect their governments to shield them or help them with respect to these political decisions, so that there is an incongruity between the way the world is built economically and the way the world is built politically. And that is one aspect. The second aspect is that on some issues, I think economic interdependence, relations among European countries, relations between America and China are heavily influenced by the economic realities to shield them from war. Relations in regions in which ideology, religion is the dominant element, are not so susceptible to the economic factors at this moment.
Lloyd, some might argue that the global economic system is not as efficient and well organized as it might be, just looking at the evidence of the last few weeks.
Well, it was efficient, all right.
But taking Henry's point, if you could offer advice to the people who are organizing the world's political system, what would you like to see? Where could real progress be made in the short term?
Well, I think these political units are, a very important. I don't want to say, I'm tempted not to say it, but I tend to say vestige of a different order. And now, beyond the fact that national board, because of Europe, look at the rise of tribalism around the world, where governmental units, forget about the fact that government units are giving way because the unit is expanding beyond the border of a single country, as in the case of Europe, look at the fact that the governmental unit of a state can't control its whole population because there's fractures within countries as people revert to religions, tribes, and other forms of identification besides their national unity. I think, on the whole, an awareness of self-interest. I think what governments really should be doing is education and popularizing what makes people wealthy and what creates prosperity and what lifts people out of poverty. And I think that that's where a very, very poor job has done. When you look at the debate even in the United States and other countries that have really been built on trade and have been the big beneficiaries of globalization, how much protectionism is rising up. And people don't understand that the pie is getting bigger, and how you create the big pie versus the political question of how you share the proceeds from that pie are getting all mucked up together, the result of which is you can see that the pandering in the political world may actually serve to make the pie stronger, whereas the economic world and the markets and their efficiency is making the pie bigger. So I think better communication, and I think better education for people, and a better safety net for the people who are represent the friction of the transition. In other words, the people who are kind of not winning in the current moment as the world is readjusting to the new order.
Other questions out there?
Sorry, Mark Champion from the Wall Street Journal, if I may. If I can address this to Dr. Kissinger, but just follow up from something that Mr. Blankfein just said. We've been talking about the need to fix the world's institutions for some years now. And when you talk to the heads of these institutions, they say they've been trying to fix them for some years now. The problem is that governments are reluctant. They resist it for one reason or another, vested interests on the Security Council, wherever it is. So I guess my question is that as the world looks a little more scary now and people get scared, it could go in two ways, you could argue. That we say, we really have to do these things now, because if we don't, we're in trouble. Or you can see the rise of protectionism and people burying themselves. So which way do you think it will go?
It isn't clear to me yet which way it will go. Because if the economic crisis becomes very severe, and if it produces great demands by populations on their governments to do something about it, the easier course for governments in the short term is to do decisions that can be handled by the national decision-making process, rather than throw it into an international, then to reform the international system, because reforming the international system is extremely time-consuming. If the crisis is overcome, and as we look at the political issues that are coming up, like non-proliferation, energy, climate, one could hope that the world will come, or governments will come to the realization that the institutions have to be changed. But that then has two aspects. One, how do you reform? What will be the institutional change? And how do you prevent the new institutions from working themselves into paralysis? It is easy to nominate new members to the Security Council, but it is hard to imagine how, it is much harder to imagine how that Security Council would operate when you multiply vetoes, or whom you could induce to modify the vetoes. So the outcome depends in part on the economic side, on the extent of the crisis, and on the political side, on the extent to which we manage the proliferation issue. Because if nuclear weapons proliferate and we don't create institutions of global management, we will head for a catastrophe.
George, in your earlier comments, You implied and said explicitly at one point that American leadership is very important in helping to integrate China, in particular, into the global community. What steps would you like to see the U.S. take, either in the balance of the Bush administration or the next administration, to achieve the end that you would like to see?
Well, I think we need to do big things and small things. If China were not a member of the WTO today, trade disputes with China would be much more difficult to resolve. If the world turns protectionist, without a strong WTO, it would be harder put to hold back the pressures, moving us in the wrong direction. An issue which is on the agenda right now is, of course, the Doha Development Agenda. And it doesn't look as if we are making very much progress. But if, over a period of time, people feel disheartened about the multilateral trading system and start making alternative preparations, alternative plans in their minds, then the institution will be weakened, and the next time we run up against a crisis, it'll be harder to overcome some of the problems. Then, small things like the WEF. I've been here over a period of 15 years, and it's become more cosmopolitan. I see many Chinese and Asians coming now, and we interact on the basis of a common civility, on common norms, with a common jargon. And if you think about it, it's all in the English language. It was all made possible by long years of the American ascendancy. It required a certain generosity on the part of the US to treat others on the basis of a rough equality. You know, when you take photographs, it doesn't matter where you stand, whereas in Asia, when you mount the podium to take photographs, you know your position. So if we can have these things in different sectors, in different parts of the world, create a habit of consultation, of mutual respect, then when we have a crisis, it'll be easier to overcome them.
George, I'm going to take that as your last comment, and I would like to ask everyone else on the panel to make a brief closing comment. Bernard, why should we be optimistic that Europe this time will get together and play that dramatic, constructive role that you outlined?
Because you all ask question about Europe, because this is the new, if I may say so, 60 years, yes. But the sort of new appreciation in between, I told you, I repeat, sovereignty and sort of diversity. Because this is the only place where you can keep your own personality as a nation and at the same time working all together to face the problems. Because this is just the beginning of a very young life, and we have to of course, to work inside our countries and other time inside our countries. Because from outside it's look very, very interesting, and it is very interesting, but inside, if you are telling the people in France, in my country, that delocalization of their industry is a good asset for them, starting the life, certainly you will be badly received. So we have, as you say, offered against borders, and I love the way without borders, yes, across a period of time, you have to say the truth to the people. It will be difficult for them because of the social welfare system, because of the cost of work, etc. It will be for sometimes very difficult to face. Then we'll get a new chance. So I'm optimist, but we have to tell the truth and to work with the people, with the population, in order to get a real unanimous movement inside Europe.
President Paris, give us some reason for optimism that the great cultural changes, developmental changes that you outlined before will take place fast enough to get a resolution in your part of the world?
When Prime Minister Kudrin asked who is going to be the conductor of the new age, I'm not sure we need a conductor. I think we need a composer. Namely, what they are calling Zukunftsmusik. It's not the military marches that will go on. Every day we have almost a new age and a different age. And for that reason, I suggest strongly not to compare with what has happened, but to try to imagine what may happen. And while the economy is the most important locomotive for progress, but economy depends upon innovation. You don't sell commodities you have, you sell new stuff in the way of commodities, organizations, whatever you want, enterprises. We're in a changing time. Now to the question if war are possible or not, will be possible or not. I would say war of protest, maybe. War of achievements, I don't see what can you achieve by war. Armies cannot conquer wisdom. Military cannot advance our time. So any reasonable person will not go to war. The only temptation may be mass destruction weapons, but also just to kill and destroy. What can they achieve? Or terror, the same thing. And the problem is if reason will prevail or not. This is the real problem. There is a lot of unreasonable people because there is a change of guard in our time. Most of us, people generally prefer to remember rather than to think. Because what you call remembering is forgetting. You remember only the nice things. You forget the difficult things. And to change is troublesome because you're all the time dealing with the unknown, untested. You have to take risks. But all told, when I look today at the humanity, all of them made progress. We are not as poor as we used to be. We are not as sick as we were. We are not as pessimistic as we should be. And if you want to have a good example, look at your children. They are stronger than you are. They are more knowledgeable than you are. They are not victims of past prejudices. They are more open. And frankly, I can learn from my children more than I can teach them. So why should they take my knowledge, which is old stuff? Let them move ahead. I do believe that now the new age is entering the Middle East. For me, it's the greatest hope because it's not a war between Arabs and Jews or Muslims and Christians and Jews, not of cultures. It's really among generations. And I see many graduates from universities in the Arab world and the Muslim world. It takes time. But suppose you'll go to war, what are you going to win? Land is not as important as it used to be. And the knowledge has nothing to do with wars. May I say also that I do not believe that there will be a conventional war. If at all, it can be either a war of terror or a war of mass destruction weapons, because the world became ballistic rather than geographic. You are not limited by distances, you are not limited by land, and so on and so forth. Now, maybe birth is a difficult experience, particularly for the lady that has to give the birth. But we should help to bring birth. Each of us, all of us, including this gathering of people. I think each of us feel today that he lives in a strange world. On one hand, very global. On the other hand, very individual. A single person can make a profound change in our life by innovating, by forecasting. And maybe we need a Beethoven rather than a Toscanini.
Deputy Prime Minister Kudrin, do you have a last thought to offer on the subject of the new concert of power?
I really, really liked the answer of Mr. President. I really enjoyed your answer, Mr. President, that we need a composer and not a conductor. It's an excellent answer to the State Secretary Condoleezza Rice, who actually raised the question. She is the one who asked, who is the conductor? So I'd like to agree also that we need to move away from the concept of war, the concept of blocks. And we have this opportunity. I'd like to also agree with Henry that political structures lag behind economic development. Let's have a look. There are examples. We have NATO. NATO is enlarging, it's accepting new members. This is the right way? Or is this the wrong way? Is this the structure that is living in the past century? Should NATO be abolished? Should other collective efforts be established, including Russia and China? Because all our countries are pursuing the same objective, to maintain peace, to maintain welfare. We have the opportunity in the very nearest future to show our political desires. We can do away with blocks.
Thank you. Lloyd, the markets have the last word, and you have the last word here.
Well, let me just say I'm an optimist, and I enjoyed hearing the comments. I think that in most situations when you're having a transformation of power, usually and something has to happen, you'd think that there would be nothing inevitable about it, but rather there has to be an assertion and an extraordinary change. I think in this particular case, it feels to me that the transition is inexorable unless intervened in. When I see what's happening today, when I see the countries that have capital surpluses inevitably going out and needing to invest those surpluses, the countries that need those surpluses and those reserves have to take them. This conversation about whether sovereign wealth funds are good or not, what would we be doing now if that capital hadn't been accumulated and hadn't been available to the developed world when the developed world needed it? And so they're evolving. When everyone around here agrees, of course, as you would, that the Bretton Woods structure, the post-World War II structure, has to be reformed, and we have to admit these emerging economies, that it's inevitable and legitimate and necessary for the world, and everybody says it. Now, I think we can screw this up, and people can intervene, and people can hang on. But I think when I look at what's occurred and people's state of mind and the evolution that's happened over the last couple of years, I'm quite optimistic that this transformation will happen in a peaceful way, and that everybody is pretty much knows what has to happen, and we'll all be on the same page.
As usual, Davos sessions like this one are not the ends of a conversation, but are often important beginnings. And in periods of change, there's a special demand for creativity and flexibility. And I want to thank all the members of the panel for their contributions in both of those areas. Thank you very much.